by being falsely flagged, they're stateless, which means they're completely outside, all international rules. And in the case of Venezuela, we saw that those flagless, stateless vessels could therefore be seized.
Welcome to Trade Treasury Payments, the podcast unlocking the future of cross-border finance.
From transaction banking and money movements
to liquidity, treasury, and cash management.
We bring you expert insights and the latest trends shaping global finance.
Welcome back to the Trade Treasury Payments podcast. My name is Carter Hoffman, and I'm the trade editor at TTP. When it comes to trade, one of, if not the most important aspects is, of course, shipping. Especially today, shipping truly is on the front lines of global trade, especially when you consider things like sanctions, geopolitics, and all of those maritime risks, and really the impact that they can have on some of those trade transactions. So to help us unpack what's really going on at sea, I'm joined today by Michelle Bockmann, Senior Maritime Intelligence Analyst at Windward, and someone who has decades of experience tracking tanker movements and deceptive shipping practices around the world. Now that makes her one of the leading voices helping governments and industry to really understand what's going on in this often misunderstood space. So Michelle, welcome to Trade Treasury Payments.
Thanks very much for having me, Carter.
Thank you. So why don't we just start off with a quick introduction? Who are you, where are you from, and what do you do?
So I'm Michelle Bockmann, and I'm the Senior Maritime Intelligence Analyst at Windward. Windward is a US-owned, London-headquartered maritime AI company. Unofficially, we like to call ourselves the CIA of the oceans, but we have been around for about 14 years, providing intelligence to government and commercial clients around the world.
Very interesting. And CIA of the Oceans is a very, very interesting title. I quite like that.
Unofficially, of course.
So in terms of, I suppose what we're seeing a lot right now on the trade side from the maritime side, there's, of course, been a lot of movements that I'm sure we'll get into in details here. But one of the things that I've seen come up again and again has been this idea of the shadow fleet and sort of, different ships moving around there. So I was hoping if you could give just a really quick explanation, maybe 60 seconds or so, of how you would explain the concept of a shadow fleet to somebody who's, involved in trade, but not necessarily a maritime expert per se.
Sure. So the shadow fleet, dark fleet, ghost fleet, it goes by a lot of names. There's no specified definition, but typically it's a parallel fleet that operates outside international rules-based order that is involved in shipping sanctioned oil, mostly from Russia, Iran, and previously Venezuela, which is a whole new dimension. Typically they're old. The beneficial owner is unknown. They don't have insurance. They deploy a range of deceptive shipping practices, and they are solely deployed on these trades. So they don't ship any oil from Saudi and then do a cargo from another country. Very concerning because they're a massive danger to international maritime safety and security. And about the Windward dark fleet list of internationally trading tankers, I think the last time I did the numbers, about 2/3 of them are sanctioned now. So, a huge concern to the global shipping world.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose the natural question after that is who are some of the actors behind some of these vessels and fleets?
Well, this is the thing. The beneficial owner is actually hidden behind these Byzantine structures that are in jurisdictions where you actually can't find out. So Marshall Islands, United Arab Emirates, China, Mauritius, Seychelles, India. I mean, you name it, and they're everywhere. Some of the vessels that have been in the headlines lately, for example, the Skipper, which was the very first tanker that was seized by the US off Venezuela, that actually had the owner, and I'm doing in little commas here, was in Nigeria. But when you check that address in Google Maps, it was like a road where there were dirt road with chickens going down the side. I found the owners, once again, inverted commas, for some of these ships purportedly in Hemis off in Moldova, carpet malls in Dubai, and a disused shopping mall in Mumbai, India. So, they're untraceable.
Mm-hmm. And of course, especially when you're dealing with kind of shadow institutions like this, there's not going to be some kind of published record of everything, because that kind of goes against the whole idea of trying to, do it behind the scenes, behind the radar and whatnot on that side. So I suppose the question to you, like, what are some of those practices? Like you mentioned some of those deceptive shipping practices that these fleets will use going on. What do some of those look like? Like, what are some of the more common techniques that you'll see from some of these shipping fleets?
The range of deceptive shipping practices, the whole idea is to obfuscate the destination and the origin of sanctioned cargo. So it can be those Byzantine shipping structures. It can be using repeated name and ownership changes over and over and over again. Each vessel has a automatic identification system, like a vessel tracking, like a transponder, and they can spoof their location, so they can pretend to be in one place when they're really somewhere else. They can go dark. They can turn that vessel transponder off. There's a whole range of things that they can do in order to hide and make their movements very opaque. There's like ship-to-ship transfers in international waters beyond port state control. Most cargo, like an Iranian cargo, won't go directly from port A to port B. It will go via ship-to-ship transfers of 3 other vessels. Again, a deceptive shipping practice. That's just the beginning of what they do.
Mm-hmm. So how, on your side, trying to track some of this, like how does the CIA of the oceans, as you said, like how do you see some of these indicators and kind of translate what, data being sent out from these AIS systems or not being sent out, and how do you interpret that translating into actual movement of these illicit goods? Like, what are some of those steps that you're taking?
Right. Well, firstly, we have a proprietary model that actually identifies these vessels based on their behaviour. So Windward has a dark fleet of about 2,000 vessels. When you pare that down to internationally trading tankers, you get down to about 1,000, 1,100 that are involved in sanctioned Iranian, Venezuelan and Russian trades. And so we can monitor when vessels go dark, ship-to-ship transfers, trace all those different ownership changes. But increasingly, we're finding that AIS is now unreliable to give a full picture of what is happening. And so we're integrating satellite technology examples so we can layer that upon the AIS data we receive. And so when a vessel goes dark, we can actually see and identify it at a port. So, for example, you'll never see a tanker with an AIS on loading at Cargill in Iran, which is the biggest export port. Every single vessel that loads there does so either dark, with it switched off, or while it's spoofing its location. But satellite technology is increasingly revealing and identifying that. And that's, something very new that's come as these vessels have become more sophisticated in their sanction circumvention and evasion tactics.
Very interesting. So another term that I've heard come up again and again, kind of looking into this, and again, I'm certainly no expert in maritime shipping, but the idea of false flags and false flagging. Can you explain what that is and maybe how it relates to everything else we've been talking about here?
Sure. So one of the typical typologies of the dark fleet, initially in the early days, especially since Russia invaded Ukraine and the oil price cap was imposed on Russian oil and shipping, was to seek out permissive flag registries. So I often use the analogy. It's like if I'm a ship owner and I have a ship, and if you have a car and you need to register it, you have to register it in the state that you're driving it in. But in shipping, you can actually choose anywhere in the world to flag your vessel and be subject to their rules. And if you're a dark fleet tanker and you don't follow the rules, you are going to choose a country with a flag that doesn't really care, doesn't check your paperwork, has very little oversight. And there have been a lot of opportunistic flag registries, often privately operated on behalf of governments, that have allowed vessels to register with them. So fast forward, these vessels have become, they've been sanctioned. About 1,100 vessels have been sanctioned cumulatively since the beginning of 2023 by the UK, US, and EU. And so these permissive registries have been in a bit of a pickle because the Western governments have gone to their countries and said, hey, look, you're flagging us, vessels that we've sanctioned, Barbados being, one, Cook Islands, Gabon, etc. And so they've deflagged those vessels, and eventually they've flagged hop to different registries, and they've been squeezed, and they've gone to a fraudulent registry. So this is a registry that doesn't even exist, and we've now identified 20. In fact, I identified one today, Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea doesn't have an international ship registry, but somebody has set up a website purporting to be one and will issue fraudulent certificates. And you've got Benin, Angola, Mozambique, Maldives, Mali. I mean, I can cycle through a whole lot of African countries who all of a sudden have got a flag registry. Now, it's not me saying that they're fraudulent. It's the International Maritime Organization, which is the United Nations agency that regulates shipping, that goes to the maritime administration of these companies and says, do you flag this ship? And like Guyana, for example, which has been a victim of fraudulent registries, has said, well, actually, no, we don't have an international ship registry. So those vessels are then falsely flagged. By being falsely flagged, they're stateless, which means they're completely outside, all international rules. And in the case of Venezuela, we saw that those flagless, stateless vessels could therefore be seized, interdicted under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, which is the sort of constitution of the oceans which underpins the 12 billion tons of seaborne trade every year.
And you mentioned the example of Venezuela. Of course, that was big news
Yes.
a little while ago. Can you give a little bit of an explanation from the shipping and maritime side of what you saw going on with that specific case study, and maybe bring in some of these examples that we've talked about here?
Sure. So at the time of speaking, the US has seized 9 tankers that have been involved in the Venezuela blockade, all sanctioned and all falsely flagged with of course, the sort of sidebar for the Bella 1 Marinera, which reflagged to Russia. So essentially, pre the naval blockade, which was imposed around about the beginning of December, Venezuela primarily shipped its oil, about 2/3 of it oil, went to China. It was all done on dark fleet tonnage, and most of it was done using deceptive shipping practice, the spoofing, everything that you saw there. A lot of this tonnage was sanctioned, and it was also falsely flagged. So at the time of the blockade and the quarantine, the vessels that were quarantined there were vulnerable to seizure under Article 110 of UNCLOS, that convention that I mentioned earlier. So the skipper being a prime example, it was spoofing its location. At the time it was seized, it was purporting to be actually off Guyana. It was falsely flagged with Guyana, which doesn't have an international ship registry. And it was therefore stateless. It was a very large crude carrier. It was, I think I mentioned earlier, it had the anonymous Byzantine ownership in Nigeria. So really a classic dark fleet tanker. But from a shipping perspective, what made this event really noteworthy is that it has given a template for European governments that are also grappling with the problem of the dark fleet and these stateless vessels, which are daily sailing through their waters on their way to load and to sail and sail back with Russian oil loaded in Baltic ports. So normally vessels have what's called the right of innocent passage as they sail through coastal waters. So even though they may be sanctioned, even though they may not be following the rules, if they have a flag, a legitimate flag, they have this right of innocent passage. But when you're flagless and stateless, you can be boarded. And until the US action, governments in Europe had really stood back and were grappling with this dilemma. And so it really has highlighted and amplified a solution for Europe. And they're, as we speak, putting together a 20th sanctions package. And there's been some very strong language, a little bit of action, but strong language on how to deal with these stateless vessels. And we're also seeing Russia respond very quickly to this threat. Obviously, even though we don't know who the owners are, we know ultimately the beneficiaries are, the regime. And so those vessels are now reflagging, some to Russia. Some of them went to Cameroon, a legitimate registry, but very permissive. And Cameroon have just announced that they're going to strike those vessels off their registry. So we're having a game of flag governance whack-a-mole to control the dark fleet. So that was all being triggered by the December 10 interdiction of Skipper by the US back in Venezuela. Sorry for that long answer. It's a highly complex and nuanced area.
Very interesting. So how easy or difficult, like what's the process if a ship's going to change its flag? Is that a relatively straightforward kind of application process? Like how does that look?
Well, it depends. It depends on what sort of ship owner you are. If you're a dark fleet ship owner, you can just go online and provisionally register your flag with a registry that offers online, no questions asked registration, and says, fine, come and register with us. And, you can have provisional registration for 3 months and you can get your documents to us. And of course, if you're looking to circumvent the rules, and this has been happening, more and more frequently, which is why we have this phenomena of flag hopping, is the vessel will register with Comoros online and say, yeah, I'll give you my documents. And then 2 months and 29 days later, the vessel then provisionally registers with another permissive registry online and says, fine, I'll give you my documents in 3 months. And then 2 months, 29 days later, you get the picture. So that's the way to do it if you're looking to deploy some sort of regulatory arbitrage and really operate on the margins of shipping. A good ship owner, of course, will not use those registries and will do all the documentation correct. The best open registries are Liberia and Marshall Islands, and I can guarantee you that nothing like that process would be done for a quality register and a quality ship owner.
So what's the solution to this? Like, how do we, what can governments or organizations do to help kind of quell this false flag, shadow fleet, like all of these issues that we're seeing kind of helping to proliferate, I guess, some of this illicit shipping?
Yeah, well, this really is an unprecedented situation. And I know unprecedented is a word that's tossed around a lot, but this is something that policymakers are really grappling with, because while you've always got this problem of substandard shipping, there's always going to be low-level bottom feeders. This is the first time that we've seen the formation of a dark fleet of this size, with about 20% of the internationally trading tanker fleet sort of outside international rules-based order. So the problem that policymakers have is that these sanctions are not from the United Nations, they're unilateral. So you have to really come at this problem from a regulatory point of view. And of course, that means that the problem has to be sorted out at the International Maritime Organization, because these vessels, irrespective of where you stand on sanctions, are a menace to the environment, to maritime safety. They're an accident waiting to happen because of their age and their condition. And many of them, even if they have insurance, their insurance is invalidated, especially if they're stateless. So if you have an oil spill going through the Danish Straits or the English Channel, marine insurers have said this is $1 billion accident. So there's a lot at stake here for governments to sort it out. One idea, of course, is to board these vessels under Article 110 of UNCLOS. In the US case, they've then used civil forfeiture in rem in some of the vessels to seize the cargo. But often in the early examples we're seeing, these vessels will have a port state control inspection, and then they will be detained if there are elements of that vessel's, if it's lacking compliance with the rules and regulations and conventions to which the flag state is signatory. So countries are also, very aware of the fact that they don't want to seize these vessels and then have them stuck in their ports. That's a very, very expensive way to manage the dark fleet problem. It's really not an easy problem. So watch this space. There are some ideas going around. Of course, sanctions on the enablers of the dark fleet, those that are providing marine services to them, agents, flags, insurers, oil traders, the sanctions net is tightening on them. But again, this is an unprecedented situation. So in the couple of months, I think we'll see some sort of options evolve.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest enforcement gaps right now in terms of equivalence? I know you just kind of rhymed off some strategies that we could potentially pursue, but what are some of the biggest gaps that you think exist right now?
Well, the very obvious one is, where are these cargoes going? Who is the buyer and the receiver of this deeply discounted sanctioned oil? And the answer is China. A third of China's oil that they import, seaborne imports, is from Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. So they obviously are allowing these vessels in that condition come into their ports. Even though a vessel is stateless, it may not have relevant or insurance for which liability can be proved. It may not meet any of the rules and regulations to which that country may be signatory, but there's no enforcement at that level, and that's because obviously China's view on sanctions is very different to the US and the Western government's view.
Hey, enjoying this podcast? Hit that follow button for more. Done? Let's get back to it.
So I feel like when it comes to international shipping, international trade, especially when you see it a lot now, it's almost impossible to separate geopolitics from
Exactly
economically. Yeah. So I guess from your perspective, like, how much are geopolitics and a lot of those pressures shaping, shipping behavior versus just kind of like the economics of the space in general?
Well, back before 2018, a lot of my job was looking at just, your basic supply and demand fundamentals. How many tankers were on the water, how many tankers were being built, how many refineries were being built, how much oil was being shipped. It was all, very, very simple when you look now. But geopolitics, let's just talk about a recent example. For the US has stated that India is going to stop buying Russian oil, and it's being tied to tariffs. So that has meant a shift in Indian buying patterns. So they're now buying, I think if there was a statement that they're taking some Venezuelan cargoes, they're buying different buys from the Middle East Gulf. And then you have EU sanctions on importing petroleum products from Russia-derived crude, which has completely recalibrated refined product global trade lanes. That's just a very recent example, and that will change. A ship, instead of taking diesel from India to Europe, which was a market before this ban was imposed on January 17. Now you have diesel coming all the way from the Middle East Gulf through to the Mediterranean and Northwest Europe because those markets have changed. The Houthis have partially shut down the Red Sea, and even though there hasn't been an attack for quite a while now, a lot of Western focused tankers won't go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. That's completely recalibrated oil trades once again. So everything, almost everything that is shaping the supply and demand and ton-mile demand factors for shipping is now tied to geopolitics.
Yeah, it's fascinating too when you think about everything that's been going on and how much everything's been changing as well. You mentioned
Sure.
Less than a decade ago, your job was completely different.
Yeah.
How, I mean, like when you talk about all of this and all of the, I'll say, shady actors in the space, like it's hard to imagine, or it makes me think about like some of the legitimate actors in the space. Like how is all of this impacting, legitimate ship owners that are just trying to move real, permissible cargo from point A to point B?
Well, volatility is good for business. I mean, like all businesses, really. So, for example, the removal of effectively 20% of this tonnage into non-compliant trades means that there are fewer ships and more business for legitimate owners. So, in a way, they're not penalized by the dark fleet. When it comes to Russia, it's a little different because there is an oil price cap barely hanging in there. I think the 20th sanctions package that the EU is going to be announcing on February 24 is likely to remove or implement a full marine services ban on Russian crude, which will partially dismantle that oil price cap that was put in place in December 2022. So that, again, will recalibrate crude oil trades yet again, because it will exclude a lot of legitimate European tonnage has been involved in those price cap compliant trades, and they will now have to be shifted into compliant trades. But, I always say that it's impossible to make any reliable forecasts for this sector at the moment, because you're only one really social media post away from the US president from everything being upended again. So, I can't really reliably say what's going to happen next week.
No, that makes again, like we were saying beforehand, if we had prepped for this call even a week ago, everything we had said would have been, largely at this point, just with how quickly everything's moving. I guess the next question I want to ask, like in terms of risks and whatnot, like obviously, there's inherent risks involved in shipping, but when you're dealing with some of these shadow fleet, false flag kind of operations, who ultimately bears those risks when something goes wrong?
Well, if there's a casualty, or if you accidentally find yourself taking on a sanctioned Russian cargo via a ship-to-ship transfer because you've been given dodgy paperwork.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like any situation like that, like who's on the hook really at the end of the day?
Well, when it comes, let's talk a maritime casualty, of which I'm so surprised there hasn't been one yet because of the condition of these tankers. I often say that they're no more than floating rust buckets. Should there be a casualty as the vessel sort of like goes through the Strait of Gibraltar, or let's do a casualty in the Caribbean. Let's take the clock back to November. If one of those dark fleet tankers had an accident in the Caribbean, it likely wouldn't have had any insurance or invalidated insurance. So the coastal state is on the hook. I mean, there are some mechanisms in place that may provide for some payments, but it depends to which conventions that country is signatory. But if you're if you're a very large crude carrier, you're carrying 2 million barrels of crude, and that is a massive accident, on a scale that, we don't even really want to think about. So coastal states will bear the brunt of a dark fleet tanker if there's an accident. In terms of risk from becoming involved with these vessels, it depends, on shipping companies' risk tolerance and those around it. But yeah, I mean, that's why companies like Windward exist, because we identify the behaviour risks for these vessels. And if you want to make sure you don't touch them, then you buy products like Windward in order to keep your business risk free. There's not really another solution at the moment to make sure that you're not engaged with these ships.
So you said, you mentioned the coastal states in that sense, but I'd imagine that a lot of times the coastal states largely, they're not necessarily involved in a ship moving past their shores.
Well, they don't. I mean, a great example, I'm speaking to you from London. Ships go through the English Channel almost daily on their way to and from Russia. Some of them are falsely flagged, some of them are in terrible condition. And there's a coalition of 14 governments here, the Nordic Baltic 8++ it's called. And they have coast guards and they surveil these vessels. They share intelligence about them. They contact them with their radio. They ask for details about their flag, their insurance. They're doing everything they can to kind of legally harass them and find out what they can. Some of them respond, apparently about 20% of them don't. But that is really, the only avenue if a vessel is properly flagged that is available to governments at the moment. And as I said, if there's a casualty, if that vessel runs into difficulties, if it loses propulsion, if it has a crash with another ship, it's the coastal states that are going to bear the brunt of that.
So jumping back again, you mentioned kind of some of the people that are working on some of these ships. I suppose what's the question that I'm trying to ask here? What kind of situation would some of these crew members that are coming onto ships that, as you said, they're basically floating rust buckets, they're operating away from legitimate channels. Why would some of these crew members sign up for a ship like that? Or is it just that's the only option available to a lot of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm so glad you've asked that, because crew welfare is one of the forgotten areas of the dark fleet. So every one of these vessels has, between 20, 25 crew on board. Now, these are usually from developing countries. And no, they don't have a choice. And often they don't realize the vessel is sanctioned or that it's a dark fleet vessel till they come on here. Now, the conditions they're working in are appalling. A lot of these vessels, the conditions are no more than indentured labor, is some of the feedback I've had. Crew members that have been on there that have contacted me, and usually if you found me, you're pretty desperate and you're looking beyond everywhere in order to sort of seek help. A lot of them have, they're clearly, their mental health has suffered because of the conditions they're working on, and the fact that this is their livelihood. This pays for their family, for their children's education. Recently, there has been moves to sanction the masters of the vessel, and initially I didn't know how I felt about that, because I do believe that the crew don't have chance or the opportunity to know, that there are now awareness campaigns being put together by organisations like the International Transport and Workers Federation. But my view is kind of shifting in the past months, because a lot of these masters, especially for the Russia trading ships, they have Russian security on board now. So there are I think it's Moran Security, which is the evolved arm from the Wagner security group. I mean, this blurring of military and commercial is increasingly common. So as a master, you know perfectly well, what ship you're on and what you're expected to do. And usually they are Russian or from one of the stands or, former Soviet Union countries. So, yeah, that's where I stand by that. But I do feel an enormous sympathy for crew members whose welfare has been imperiled by the fact that through no fault of their own, they've accepted a job on the dark fleet vessel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose the question, I mean, you may or may not have an answer to this, but like, is how do you go about, I suppose, stopping this dark fleet or some of the illicit activities that go on without, negatively impacting some of those crew members who this may be, the only source of livelihood for themselves and their family that they've been able to come across.
Yeah.
So it's,
I mean, traditionally crew members are, they're not outspoken, and they're nearly always, whether they're on a legitimate vessel or a non-dark fleet vessel, they will very rarely complain about their conditions, and it takes a lot for them to complain, and they worry very much that they'll be put on a blacklist. I don't think there's an answer for that, except for awareness campaigns, and often when I talk to some of the organisations and NGOs that are thinking along these lines, it's just encouraging seafarers to put in the IMO number, the number that identifies a vessel, just so they can tell before they accept a contract whether or not it's been sanctioned, because that typically will give them an indication about, what their conditions will be.
mm-hmm. No, very useful advice there. So you mentioned a little bit ago kind of that blurring between military and economic in terms of a lot of these shipping fleets.
Yeah.
You gave the one example there, but are there any other examples that you run into or trends that you're seeing in the space into how those two areas that for the last almost 100 years, you could say, have been largely distinct, but now
sure
seem blurring together a lot more?
Well, not infrequently, but increasingly more often, we're seeing some of these oil tankers get naval escorts, Russian naval escorts, when they go through sensitive waters. Interestingly, in December, we saw Ukraine drone attacks on falsely flagged ships in the Black Sea. Highly unusual for a government, a country, to attack a commercial vessel. Likely, falsely flagged vessels were chosen because they were stateless, so there was no diplomatic blowback. And you've also seen Ukraine attack another tanker in the Mediterranean because it had military personnel on board. I can kind of feel things are changing as the pressure on Russia and Iran heats up.
Michelle, I know we're almost out of time here, so I wanted to kind of wrap things up, but give you a chance to give kind of one final answer. So from where you sit and what you see, what do you think kind of the shadow fleet or a lot of this maritime shipping operations, what do you think it's going to look like by the end of, say, 2026?
That's a really difficult question. And I think the biggest difficulty in being able to predict that is that it's increasingly apparent that we need an exit ramp for sanctioned dark fleet tankers because they're old. They need to be scrapped, but they can't be scrapped. It's very hard to sell them for scrap if they're sanctioned. So there needs to be something put in place to remove them from the market. And that is, again, something I think policymakers are grappling with. And I'm hoping that by the end of the year, there is an answer to that question, which is what next for these tankers?
Amazing. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, definitely a very dynamic space. We've kind of talked through, some of the tactics that these shadow fleets are using, what exactly shadow fleets are versus false flag vessels. We talked a bit about the human element and the actual people on board. And of course, some of the policy changes that we need to see hopefully coming by the end of the year or early next year. Michelle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
And don't forget to follow Trade Treasury Payments
on your favorite podcast platform.
Thanks for listening.